Hello, everyone. Good evening. My name is Marie-Helene Budworth. I am an associate professor in the School of Human Resource Management, currently serving as director of the school. And it is in that capacity that it is my great fortune to welcome you all here this evening. I'm so glad that we are able to hold this event and able to welcome our distinguished guests. The first thing I'd like to do is read a land acknowledgement. York University recognizes that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of York University. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject to the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I also recognize that we are on disparate lands here today and encourage you all to take a moment to acknowledge the land on which you find yourself. Before we get started, I want to take a moment just to either introduce you to the School of Human Resource Management or to let those who are already part of our community know what we've been up to recently. The School of Human Resource Management continues to enjoy robust enrollment across all of our programs, the Certificate in HRM, the Bachelor of Human Resource Management, the Masters of Human Resource Management, and the PhD in Human Resource Management. And again, we won awards across all categories, all of these degree programs and certificates, and the HR Reports Reader's Choice Awards. We also have welcomed some new colleagues recently who are doing very interesting work in first Anya Kristek, who's doing interesting work in maternity leaves and such. And we have Daegu Gilsaran, who is doing some really interesting work in occupational health and safety and abusive supervision. We have also produced some really outstanding and interesting research from the colleagues who have been here all along, including Kelly Pike, who's looking at labor issues during the pandemic. And of course, you know, I can't go into the research that all of my colleagues are doing, but I encourage you to spend some time looking into the work done by the colleagues here in the school. As always, it is interesting and timely and topical. And in addition to enjoying this event, I hope that you'll take some time to explore our programs afterwards. And if you have not already, consider joining us if that should be part of your career path. The last thing I want to do is to introduce my colleague, Monica Belcourt. Monica, as many of you will know, was at York when HRM really started to find its footing here. And from that really was instrumental in building the School of Human Resource Management. So it is really, it is really fitting that this series is called the Monica Belcourt HR Lecture Series, or HR Talks. And I'll invite Monica to come to the screen to kick off the event. Thank you, everybody, and welcome again.
Thank you, Marie-Helene, for the kind introduction. I started HR Talks because I wanted very much the practitioner community and the academic community to join together. And with HR Talks, we have an academic expert talking about issues that he or she is researching, but we also have a practitioner audience that's going to engage and interact with each other. So I want to welcome everybody and hope that you join it. I very much too would like to thank Mark Podwalski, who we are all here because of all the work he's done to arrange the speaker and the technology and make this evening happen. So thank you so very much, Mark, and Mark will introduce the speaker now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Monica and Marie-Helene. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. There will be some time at the end of Dr. Ployhart's talk for Q&A. So for everybody here, please feel free to post your questions to the Q&A panel as you think of them, and we'll get to them at the end. I was so excited when our guest speaker agreed to do this year's talk. Robert Ployhart is an exceptionally accomplished researcher in our field. With over 130 publications, more than 12,000 citations, and 3 textbooks, Dr. Ployhart is ranked among the top 1% of global scholarly citations in business and economics. His primary research interests include human capital resources, recruitment, staffing, and statistical methods. He served as the past associate editor for the Journal of Applied Psychology and for organizational behavior and decision processes. And he's currently the consulting editor for the Journal of Management. He's the Bank of America Professor of Business Administration of the Darla Moore School of Business at the University of South Carolina. Like many of you here, I've been personally inspired by the impact of Dr. Ployhart's research. Most of us have probably one or more of his articles on our computer desktop or one of our graduate course reading lists. According to his webpage at the University of South Carolina, Dr. Ployhart enjoys spending his free time with his family and playing with anything that has an engine or an amplifier. So thank you for joining us today, Dr. Ployhart. It is a real honor to have you here.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you everybody for the invitation to not only be part of this amazing speaker series, but also to be able to spend the evening with you tonight. It's really amazing everything that York University has done with respect to human resources and of course the people that have made it happen. And it's just a real privilege to be able to talk about some of my research and some of my views on the profession in this type of format. Now, this evening I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to pull my screen up here while we're doing this. I'm going to be talking about human capital resources. And really, the main part of my talk is to emphasize that research and practice, or academics and practice, they need to be working together. And if, you know, we've heard that a million times, but I think what the pandemic has demonstrated is not only how important it is for academics and practitioners to work together, but how important it is for human resource academics and practitioners to work together. And of course, it would be nice if we were all together doing this live and in person. But at the same time, one of the things that I'm going to talk about tonight is the fact that we should get used to this virtual type of format because I think it's here to stay. Well, let me move ahead a little bit here. I'm sorry, I'm going to jump onto, I gave a little bit, there we go. Gave away one of my surprises, but I'm going to start with the conclusion because unlike your typical academic paper, which is going to lead up to the conclusion after about 20 or so pages, I'm going to get to the point right away because I think it's important that we understand where we want to land with all of this. And the point is that there's been a lot of active work around human capital resources over the last, well, for a long time, but especially the last maybe 15 years. But I think we're going to learn more new insights, discover more new insights about human capital resources, what they are, what they do, and how they relate to firm performance and competitive advantage if we learn from practice in this moment. And I know that maybe is mind-blowing to some of you, maybe not. But if you doubt me, you know, wait till the end, then we can come back to it and you can, we'll revisit that question. But a little fun thing to do while we're going through the talk is I've purposely used different actors or actresses to illustrate some key points. And so at the end of the talk, you can tell me if you can identify the common theme across all of these individuals. Okay, well, let me start the talk by framing where it's coming from and really why I felt this one is so important, this particular focus. If we go back to March of 2020, you know, just think of where the world was at that time. You know, we're dealing with a very fast spreading pandemic, you know, a virus that, you know, many people doubted, some people recognized immediately the seriousness. Like there's just a lot of uncertainty happening really across the globe. And towards the end of March, somewhere in that space, I remember it was later in the evening and I was working on a paper that was relating to human capital resources. And, you know, you're working along on it and it's interesting and everything. And when I took a break, I was just listening to the news that was playing in the background. And in the background, what was going on was a news story about the Empire State Building that was flashing a red and white light to honor first responders and all of the hospital staff that were struggling to keep up with this just massive infusion of people with COVID. And they'd show pictures of Times Square and it's like completely empty. And it was just this kind of eerie feeling that this is like, you knew it was serious. Maybe you didn't see it yet in your own life, but you knew it was serious. But just seeing this image on a dark evening of the Empire State Building and a city like New York basically empty, and it really it was rattling. It was scary. And as I was trying to put these two pieces together, I'm just working on this paper that's about human capital and about people and work. And what I'm working on does not feel like it has any connection at all to this moment. And to take it just a step further, I was thinking, well, in this moment, what does the literature that maybe I know the most? And we're talking about a literature that's in business schools, right? We're talking about a literature that's about the real world. It's about organizations and the people in them. What does the literature that I pay attention to have to say about the situation? And I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but what I felt is that it didn't have a whole lot to say specifically to help in this moment. That if you were to summarize what the literature says, it basically would conclude that human capital resources, whatever they are, however they're defined, however they're measured, are usually, almost always, positively related to performance, whatever that may be and however that might be measured. And I really couldn't think of anything more specific than that. Now, yeah, there's a lot of nuance in what I'm saying that I'm skipping over, but what would I do with the literature as it exists to help organizations struggle with this just incredible uncertainty? And it made me think that I couldn't come up with an easy answer. And it made me think, how did we get here? And since that time, I've been giving this just a lot of thought about why is there such a disconnect between what we know about human capital resources, which is a lot, versus what we need in this moment right now. And so I'm going to back up for just a second, and I want to throw out just some basic definitions and make sure that everybody is on the same page when I'm talking about human capital resources and what that actually means. So, my use of human capital resources is kind of consistent with where I would say the literature is today, connecting the areas of human resources, strategic management, organizational behavior, psychology, economics. It's really in this kind of central space. But human capital resources, if you're not in this literature, we're talking about the capabilities of the workforce. We're talking about the capacity of an organization's workforce, the capacity of a strategic business unit, of a store, of a restaurant, whatever it may be, the capacity of those workers to perform in ways needed to operationally and strategically achieve the organization's goals. Well, where we are today is having a better understanding that those human capital resources, and I'm really talking about collective human capital resources, the aggregation of individuals, those resources emerge from the knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics of individuals. So knowledge refers to things, such as knowledge of accounting principles or knowledge of supply chain management. Human capital comes from skills such as communication skill, technical skills, skills relating to presentations, math, things like that. Abilities are more fundamental. Abilities tend to be more enduring, mostly stable through adulthood. Here we're talking about cognitive abilities, intelligence, quantitative, verbal, things like that. And then there's these other characteristics such as personality, values, or interests. So we'll see this abbreviation a lot, KSAO, standing for knowledge, skill, ability, and other characteristics. But the emergence of human capital resources is from these KSAOs of individuals. And that may seem obvious, especially if you come from more of a psychology, human resource, OB background. But there was a time where there was some debate over whether that was right or whether that was even relevant. And I think the field has moved past that. So human capital resources emerge from these characteristics of individuals. And for the most part, it's expected that human capital resources are antecedents or determinants of firm performance, business unit performance, whatever that may be. And we may be talking about operational, financial, market, things of that nature. We might be talking about competitive advantage if we're looking at it from a strategic management point of view. But it's important to recognize that human capital resources are not performance. They're distinct. They're the cause, they're the antecedent, they're the determinant, but they are different from performance itself. Likewise, human capital resources are not HR practices. Practices like selection, training practices, development programs, compensation programs, and things like that. Human capital resources are really the result of those HR activities. We may implement HR practices with the ultimate goal of shaping performance, but the way performance is shaped is through those practices' effects on the resources themselves. And then finally, I think there's pretty good agreement that the broader labor market, if you're in strategy, the strategic factor market, that market moderates the relationship between human capital resources and performance, such that under some market conditions where there may be more mobility among employees, it's harder for organizations to benefit from human capital because that human capital is so mobile that it can move to other competitors. Well, this is just a simple framework to kind of lay out the groundwork that we'll be talking about later, and it gives us a point to start from understanding why the literature is not neatly aligned to the kinds of problems that organizations are struggling with today. Well, let me just briefly summarize what the research says around a lot of these different pieces. So if we focus just on where do human capital resources come from, since about 2010, 2011, there's been around 120 or so empirical articles that have been published on human capital resources specifically, maybe around another 60 or so that are more conceptual in nature. The point is, it's a pretty active area of research. And when we look at the antecedents side of the equation, where a lot of this work is focused, is trying to understand how different HR practices contribute to the formation, the creation of different types of human capital resources. There's been a lot of work that examines the work context and the manner in which people are combined in organizations, and how different combinations of the same people can create vastly different types of human capital resources. So on a very simple scale, if you think about a team of maybe 8 people, how we combine those members' inputs, how we structure that team, whether it's just additive or whether they have to work together in a very interactive, collaborative manner, that's going to shape the nature of that human capital resource. So we can create different resources simply by combining people's inputs in different ways. Even though their KSAOs stay the same, we'll produce a different type of resource. Likewise, and maybe more simple to understand, different combinations of the KSAOs themselves can produce different resources. And we've known for a long time through things such as attraction, selection, and attrition models, that if we attract certain kinds of people with certain kinds of knowledge, for example, that we select people based on that knowledge and that we're able to retain them, that we'll be able to build these collective human capital resources that are related to performance. So there's a lot of work actually that's already been done and has been done on the antecedent side of the equation. But I want to point out that most of this work is housed in areas that are traditionally human resources, organizational behavior, and organizational psychology. If we look at the back end of the equation, here we enter the domain of strategic management and more economics-based ways to think about human capital resources. And here, more of the attention is focused on understanding the relationship between the resource and the broader labor market or factor market. And a lot of work in strategic management examines what happens when there are these labor market frictions, we might call them, or imperfections. So the classic argument is something like this. that when the labor market is efficient, the value of the talent that we acquire in that market is basically offset by its acquisition costs. And so if that's correct, there's no way for a firm to really achieve a competitive advantage because there's no secret out in that labor market. The cost of acquiring the talent that you need is going to be offset by the value it brings to the organization. That's when it's a fully efficient market. But if there are these market frictions, for example, you have an ability to attract talent that the competitor doesn't recognize as worth as much. There's an opportunity then for the organization or sometimes the individual to take advantage of those market frictions and capture more value than might otherwise have been predicted. So the classic argument in strategic management as it relates to human capital is that for an organization that can make the human capital resources firm specific, meaning that they can't be traded on a factor market, that they're of no value to competitors, creating resources that are more specific to the organization are going to have the opportunity to better create competitive advantage for that firm because they aren't traded as efficiently on a factor market. So that's the logic of all these different kinds of mobility, whether the talent is internal or external. All of these kind of topics in strategic management really, I think, stem from that basic insight. Then there's some research that looks at, do human capital resources have different relationships with different types of firm performance? Largely finding that the relationships are stronger when we're talking about things such as productivity, operational types of performance, and the relationship being a little bit weaker if we're talking about things such as financial performance or market performance. And then finally, collective turnover throws a wrench in the whole thing. Collective turnover largely nullifies the effects of human capital resources. So I'm summarizing here in a very broad level, and I'm exaggerating the summaries a bit. There's some inconsistencies in what I'm saying in the literature, but by and large, I think this summarizes it fairly well. And so at the end of the day, we see an active area of research around antecedents and consequences, but this research really follows closely to the line that is drawn between your kind of more micro HR, OB, applied psychology disciplines and those from strategy. And I took just a somewhat educated guess here to try to lay these different topics out. And don't worry about what the topics specifically refer to. My point is that I can take the different topics that are actively being studied right now, and they hew pretty closely to the traditional trajectories of human resources or strategy. And if we look at it from that perspective, it raises the question then, how are we not more closely aligned to what's going on in this COVID world right now? Well, the answer to that question is because nowhere in our past have these research trajectories really focused on trying to understand the types of situations we're facing today. So thinking about different kinds of human capital resources means something very different in our post or current COVID world than it meant before. And I think that we really need to come to grips on the academic side with the fact that the insights that are going to drive our understanding forward in the fastest way aren't going to be found by looking back at the literature. I think they're going to be found by looking out the window and listening and learning from what's going on in practice. Because the pandemic, I believe, has been so much a pandemic of human resources. It's a health pandemic. It's a financial crisis. All of these things are sort of consequences of the fact that this pandemic, maybe in contrast to the last major financial economic recession, which was primarily financial in nature, this pandemic touches upon everything that's human, everything from health to well-being to financial to everything else, relationships. The fact that we're doing this over Zoom speaks to that statement. So the pandemic exposes so many of these different disconnects in a way that is just so powerfully visible. And as I was trying to think about the best way to summarize these, I came to the conclusion that there's really four major areas that I feel academics should most learn from practice, because practice isn't waiting for an answer from academics. And I don't think that's ever been true, but it's especially not true now. And I am just stunned by the innovation and the success most of the time that's gone on in organizations and making these just monumental changes to the way that they're working. And there's not a reason why academics should not be right in that conversation if we want to. So here are the four areas, just from my opinion, where I feel there's the most to learn. The first of these is what I would call the missing macro context. And I'm not talking about macro in the sense of firm strategy or industry groups or competitive groups or things like that. I'm talking macro in the sense of like pandemic level events, of global recessions, right? Of just major national disasters. And to illustrate what I'm talking about, what I have on each of these topics is a quote that I've heard by talking with different people. And they stuck in my mind when I heard them, and I wrote them down, and you know, just thinking they were interesting. And it turned out this talk was a perfect opportunity to share some of these. But the quote that I have here was from a you know, your typical middle manager, you know, chugging along before the pandemic hits, busy with all the wonderful things that we're you know, involved with. And then all of a sudden, this hits, the world shuts down, there's more time to think. And this particular individual said, the pandemic has led me to rethink my life and priorities. And it made me think, I wonder if that's ever happened before. You know, we had a pandemic similar to this about 100 years ago, the 1919 flu pandemic. And I went back to look at the literature from around that time, which admittedly was very different than what the literature looks like today. But I focus mostly on the Journal of Applied Psychology. And I could not identify and the doctoral student helping me with this could not identify a single study published on the flu pandemic in the Journal of Applied Psychology. And when the pandemic hit, I started working on a few different research projects that related to the pandemic, somewhat in response to the call from the Journal of Applied Psychology for research specifically focused on understanding the pandemic and its consequences. And I came across a body of research I had never seen before, done a lot by sociologists and in some ways organizational sociologists, more macro strategy oriented folks. And it looked at the effects of difficult economic times on people that were entering the workforce. And I was just blown away by this literature because it was not only so powerful, but it was so powerful in this moment of the pandemic, that this research shows that workers who come to the workforce during times of really disadvantaged you know, environments, bad recessions, COVID, right? It leaves an imprint on them that lasts throughout most of their career. They tend to generally have expressed greater gratitude, greater satisfaction with the job they get and with their career over the long term. They tend to have a greater sense of community. They tend to bond more strongly together. And what really stunned me by that work was that the effects weren't necessarily large, right? But they were meaningful and they were lasting over the course of decades for some of these individuals. And it made me think, what happens right now when we take a population that has experienced a massive financial recession just barely 10 years ago, several other more localized types of disruptive events since then, and then something like the COVID pandemic. And what does that do to people? And one of the studies that we were doing in response to COVID, this was a study that was really done, I believe, April and May of 2020 is when we started it. We were working with a group that was looking at job applications to different types of jobs, face-to-face and work from home opportunities. And before the pandemic hit, there was a difference between those. A lot of people wanted work from home opportunities. These are just the number of people that were applying for these jobs across a range of several organizations. But you can see that when COVID hit in a large scale at the beginning of March, the number of applications for work from home just dramatically increased. And there's some shocks in there for sure, but on average, many, many times the magnitude of those that were applying for work in in-person jobs. And one of the things that didn't wind up in the paper we ended up publishing just because of a lack of space is that these data showed pretty heavily that women and racial minorities were the ones that preferred the work remote options the most. And yet simultaneously were the ones that expressed the greatest need with help in transitioning to remote work, and also having the worst infrastructure to be able to pursue remote work, meaning they didn't have the hardware or potentially the internet access they would need to be able to do the job. Well, this was an early example, but what we've seen since then is really this, I think, just massive seismic shift in worker preference. And we hear the term, the Great Resignation, thrown all over the place. And I think that's right, but I think that actually is a bit misleading at the same time, because it gives an impression that people are just quitting work. People are moving around for sure to different types of jobs. But what I hear from a lot of the organizations that we talk with, I work with a lot with talent leaders in different large organizations, is that there's also a massive number of people who are simply leaving the workforce. And most of those people disproportionately are women and racial or ethnic minorities. They're not leaving for different jobs. They are leaving the workforce entirely. Maybe it's because of changing worker preferences. Maybe it's because the realization that the life they were living was either not sustainable or not worth it. Many causes, right? But I think that one of the real challenges for the academic literature, and something that it needs to fully embrace and pursue, is what does this do for all of our existing knowledge about efficient factor markets, about worker mobility. Again, one of the basic assumptions that's baked into so much of the human capital research is that markets are generally efficient, and when they're efficient, all these things happen. But when you have these kinds of disruptions that so monumentally shift the efficiency of the labor market so that it's no longer efficient, that worker preferences are not based on primarily economic outcomes, I don't know that we have a great ability to predict what happens in that environment. And it makes me wonder how much the literature that we've built to this point has very much prescriptive advice to say in the world that's moving forward. It is an incredible need in the research space. It is an incredible opportunity for academics and practitioners to come together, because I think everybody is going to learn something from that conversation. Okay, I'm going to shift gears to a different topic now. And this is about the missing role of performance. And this is a quote from one of the talent lead, VP of talent, or in that type of role, reporting to a chief HR officer. And the individual said, "We just need the talent who can do the job." And what struck me about that comment wasn't that it was so insightful. I mean, that seems just totally obvious, right? It was the fact that it's such a stark contrast to the way so much of the human capital research has unfolded over the last several years. And I picked this picture intentionally to highlight the fact that for most organizations, at the end of the day, they need to find a way to win in a way that's sustainable, in a way that's ethical, in a way that's appropriate. And without at least performance parity, it's really hard to argue that other things matter, that a well-functioning, a high-performing organization has the opportunity to raise all ships. And so for people, again, struggling with the pandemic, it's about staying alive, and it's about performing in this moment. And how do you do that? So with the eye on performance, what does the human capital resource research field have to say, the literature have to say? Well, the reality is most of the literature gives disproportionate attention to human capital resources and very little attention to the types of performance those resources are supposed to relate to. So an academic paper might spend the majority of the introduction talking about the resources whether they're generic or specific, whether they're tradable on a factor market, a labor market or not, all of those kinds of things. And then you get to the method section, and then the discussion is, performances in passing. Oh, we looked at earnings, or we looked at productivity or something like that. But clearly in the world, we start with performance and then think about what types of human capital do we need to deliver that performance. And this is kind of it's a really obvious point, and it's really baked into a lot of the training that at least I had in industrial organizational psychology. It's that the resources themselves are secondary to the type of performance. That performance determines which resources matter. And so let me just walk you through a visual of what I mean here. And I'm summarizing a paper that I just published on the topic. And the funny thing about that paper is I just tried to take the basic practice of personnel selection, hiring, staffing, and the logic of that, and apply it to strategic human capital resources. And it was an interesting exercise. So if we start, from a company perspective, how does the company compete? Strategy is all about where a company is going to compete, how it's going to compete, and where it's not going to compete. So where it sees its competitive space, we work backwards from that to figure out what types of more operational, financial, customer performance are needed to deliver and achieve that competitive advantage. And not all kinds of performance are equally important. So in this example, I'm just building it so that for this particular firm, they win in the market by delivering greater customer, say, satisfaction. Maybe it's customer loyalty or something like that. They need strong financial and operational performance to stay alive, but where they win is with customer performance. And if we work backwards from there, just hypothetically, we see that different types of human capital resources are going to more strongly relate to different types of performance. And in this example, personality-based human capital resources are the ones that most strongly drive customer performance. And so for this particular firm, what they ought to do is emphasize the acquisition of personality-based human capital resources, whether that's selection, developing those, assembling them and bundling them through training or job deployment or things such as that, so that they can deliver exceptional customer performance and achieve competitive advantage. We can also even get more fine-grained. In this example, I decided to focus on cognitive human capital because it's easier to see. We can look at basic intelligence as the driver of how fast and how quickly people can develop and acquire knowledge. And that type of knowledge, of course, relates to financial and operational performance in this example. But my point here is that we have this data. Most companies have this kind of data through combining their operations, their finance, their marketing functions, along with the human resource function. So we can look, for example, at test scores among candidates that are hired. We can look at training or development scores or learning if that's available. And we can link those to these financial operational metrics. And we can build this value chain that links talent, the quality of it, all the way out through the back end and where a firm actually competes and wins. And then have enormous precision about where, when, and how to build the kinds of resources we need to perform. But at the same time, the caveat with this is that if we change the performance, if the environment disrupts performance, if the environment disrupts the competitive landscape, then the kinds of resources that we need are going to change in a corresponding manner. So the implications here, I think, are fairly large in reorienting the literature to this point. And I think they reorient the literature in a way that directs it to practice. When I wrote that paper, I was thinking about it from a very practical perspective. And that's certainly the goal that I'm trying to pursue here. That strategy is to a large degree firm specific, that performance operationalizes strategy, and performance is therefore to a large degree firm specific. You can take a performance dimension like, let's say effectively manages financial resources or something like that. Something that probably every firm has in one way or another, but how that's interpreted is going to be to a large degree firm specific. And the work that I've done with either competency models or leadership development or performance management, the labels may be the same, but how it's understood is always to a large degree specific to the company and the people within it. And what this means then is that, in contrast to what the research literature might say, what drives competitive advantage is not a characteristic that's inherent in the resource, but in fact, it is a function of performance and the relationship between the resource and that kind of performance. And for those of you that are in this space, I picked this little video on purpose, because if you believe that, if you agree with that, it's potentially a mind-blowing, game-changing observation. If it is or not, you know what, well, the future will tell. But I think it has a potential to really reorient the field to being much more practical as well as academically and theoretically rigorous. Okay, a third area of change and focus is the missing work context. And I think here you're all going to be familiar with this. I had the opportunity to hear the Chief HR Officer of Prudential, Lucian Elzieri, talk about how Prudential had changed post-pandemic, and how they were grappling with the issue of hybrid work, whether that's the right choice or not. And hybrid work, just to be clear, I'm talking about, do you have everybody in the office entirely? Not at all. Somewhere in between the two. Are they at work 3 days a week, 6 days every 3 weeks, like somewhere in there? But hybrid work is a combination of in person in the office and working from home. And he said, in his opinion, it's all about the work. And what performance requires in the company dictates the answer to the type of hybrid work that's appropriate. So I would say, from what I hear, again, talking with organizations, listening to a lot of the, we have a couple of research centers here, the Center of Executive Succession and the Regal and Emory Human Resource Center. These centers bring together chief HR officers, and they work with us as faculty, talking about issues, conducting research and those kinds of things. And what I continually hear from them is the question about remote work. Remote, hybrid, what's the right mix in all of this? Academically speaking, theoretically speaking, if we change the work context, we change the way that human capital resources emerge. That, I think, is pretty clear in the literature. So hybrid work has the opportunity to radically transform the human capital resources that are already present within your organization. And so the question here comes down to, how can firms intentionally create the kind of human capital resources they need to deliver exceptional performance when the workplace is a hybrid? The question about hybrid cannot be divorced from the question about the human capital resources that the firm needs and wants. And likewise, in a hybrid work environment, if at the same time we see women and racial or ethnic minorities leaving the workforce in large numbers, how can hybrid working arrangements bring them back? Because we all need them in the workforce. They need to be part of the economy. Our economy, our entire structure, I believe, suffers and potentially gets very seriously damaged in a way that's not going to be repairable if we don't get the full workforce back and get them back soon. And so when I look at the span of these traditional topics in, going from the micro, maybe HR, OB world, all the way up to strategic management, there is not a topic that is saved from being radically disrupted due to hybrid or remote work. So for example, the kinds of resources that a firm even needs are going to change. The talk about remote work, hybrid work, seems somewhat disconnected from an understanding of the new kinds of human capital that's needed to do that kind of work. And from some of our earlier research, we found that there's a different skill set that's required to do that well. We've learned a lot of it kind of through trial and error as we've adapted to Zoom and online work and things like that. but there is an opportunity there to really hone in on what skills are needed to thrive in a hybrid or digital environment. Likewise, how human capital resources emerge when people are not making daily or regular face-to-face contact within an office setting. You know, if our relationship is limited to a couple hours a day or maybe a couple hours a week over Zoom, do we actually see human capital in the traditional sense emerge in that type of environment? Does it emerge in maybe a weaker form, or does it emerge at all? You know, these are the kinds of things that we're just starting to see in the literature, but I think it requires a much greater focus if we're going to have an impact on practice in the near term. Likewise, collective turnover, I believe, means something very different in this more hybrid environment. Generally, turnover wipes out the positive benefits of human capital resources. I wonder if that's true when so much of the workforce is distributed. When more of the workforce is remote, I have to question whether the consequences of turnover will be as severe as what we've seen when everybody's used to working face-to-face. And so I'm not going to go through all of these in great detail, but I want to point out a couple of them on the macro side, that if we're talking about mobility, it means something very different when a large part of the workforce is rarely in the office. What ties people to work is oftentimes the relationships they have with coworkers, and we know that it's oftentimes their relationship with their supervisor. That's probably the strongest determinant. But when that relationship is more transactional, when the relationship is more based off of segments that are driven by screens and timestamps on a calendar, mobility can mean something very different. You don't have that tie to the organization. And so therefore, you're out there living in your house and working from there. To switch to another organization could be simple. You don't even have to move offices, for example. You don't have to move physically out of your house for work. So I suspect that mobility will likely get much greater in a hybrid environment, because the costs of having to move, whether they're financial or just time, and the hassle of moving are largely gone. Last one here is a big one, and it is that market frictions and signals, I think, are also pretty radically disrupted in a hybrid work environment. The market is not efficient when people are voluntarily choosing to work or leave work entirely. And what that does for the way that we think about or would predict the consequences of things like firm-specific human capital resources, or the way that we would try to normally tie people to organizations, I think all of that gets thrown out the window. And I could go on and on. I'm going to spare you from any more of this, the talk about it. But here's the thing. All of this has already happened in practice. And it's where every HR person, I think, is largely struggling with one or more of these issues and trying to find the answer. And they're constructing the answer in the moment with the best information they have available. This is the opportunity for academics, for the scientific community to step up to the plate and deliver on the potential that it has to really get into these questions. And they may not be aligned to the traditional research literature, but they are probably the most interesting questions that we can ask in this moment. Okay, I'm going to leave you with just one more here, because I do want to make sure that we have plenty of time for hopefully questions. I would love to have a conversation with everybody as much as possible. So this last one is maybe a little bit different, but it's about missing worker segments in the human capital resource literature. A lot of that literature emphasizes managerial occupations. It emphasizes stars, high potentials, scientists, all of that type of thing. And on the other hand, I do a lot of my research with kind of the opposite extreme. Workers in fast food establishments, quick service establishments, bank tellers, retail, things like that. And partly it's a function of where the data is, and partly it's a function of being able to test interesting questions there. But what really became obvious to me during the pandemic was how important and how difficult the people that work those jobs are, those really retail service kinds of jobs. We know frontline first responder jobs are hard. We know that nurses, doctors, police, firefighters, those are tough jobs for sure. But I think the unsung heroes that we saw in the pandemic were the retail service types of jobs, as well as teachers. And I'm not talking about teachers in this presentation, but I think the pandemic exposed how dependent our society is on those occupations and the people that work in them. And my quote here comes from listening to somebody who was working, frontline fast food job and talking about why it was so important to keep working. And this individual said, "This job is the only stability in my life." And you hear that echoed for people that work a lot of these jobs, that a lot of them come from disadvantaged communities, depressed communities. They're working one, maybe two of these jobs. And for a lot of them, as we see in the survey research that we've done, the job is the stability in their life that they need. And if you take a step back from that, the millions of people that learn what work is in these frontline jobs is really staggering. For millions of people, where they learn how to work, how they identify with work, how their work identity is created, their values towards work, this is where it happens for millions of people. For millions of people, millions, thousands, somewhere in between, it's the stability in their life that they need. And yet, as I think the pandemic just, drastically demonstrated, it's where a lot of these employees also suffer just terrible abuse, in the sense that we saw all of the arguments over masks, the arguments over vaccine mandates. We put, these poor employees working through a pandemic, exposing themselves to health risk, especially before the vaccine was there. Then putting them in a situation where they have to deal with oftentimes argumentative or aggressive customers. Like, what a difficult job. And it should be no surprise that for so many of these workers, they've decided to change careers, their life, occupations, and so on. And I put the visual here because I think it so represents it. An entire fast food franchise in a small town. I won't give away, it's in the news and everything, but I don't want to give away the company or anything like that. The entire group of employees quit. And what struck me about the sign wasn't the fact that it said "we all quit." It's the fact that they apologized to their customers for it. That as customers, we feel bad that we now are leaving you without food service. And I think what a statement, what a powerful statement, that these jobs and people that are so frequently looked down on have that level of commitment to the people that they're trying to serve and to each other. And so a very important question, and I don't have a specific focus for the human capital area to go here, but it's time to, as my colleague Pat Wright has recently written, bring the human back into human resources. That we've been so focused on demonstrating the business impact of human resources, trying to have a seat at the table, right? Showing that human resources is as important to business function as anything else. I think our focus has been so much on that in the past that we have forgotten about a lot of the impact that HR practices, that the strategic choices that organizations make about their talent, how much that shapes and influences so many people in such a just profound and fundamental way. So my question really for the audience is, what's going to change about any of this? We're still in the grip of the pandemic. I think we all thought we'd be in a very different place last spring, be in a different place now. Last spring, we thought we'd be in a different place. And yet here we are. And it's exposed a lot of things, and it has highlighted, I think, in just a blindingly obvious way, where there are these obvious gaps, strong gaps between the academic research literature and practice. And so the question is, are we going to stick with the research trajectory, we as academics, or are we going to reorient and get out there and try to tackle the questions that will benefit many, many more people than getting an article published in a journal. And I don't think those are mutually exclusive, by the way. Really good real world impactful research is also impactful scientifically. So in my opinion, I think the pandemic has left a changed world. It's we keep hearing about the new normal. This is it. We're in it. The fact that we're doing this over Zoom, I think, is here to stay. That's what I hear from organizations, is that this type of way of working together is what they're going to continue doing. So the pandemic has exposed both divisions and opportunities. It's obviously created a highly disrupted environment, and I think how that's going to play out in terms of competition and business is unknown. Look at what's happened with General Electric just this last week, and splitting off into 3 different companies. I mean, maybe that was something that was on the horizon, but I'm not sure. Now, what's happened between the financial recession and this pandemic is just, I think, going to leave just a lasting, just massive impact on millions of young people. And I think we're going to see a radical change in the way that they view work and the place of work in their life, the tension between those two. I think that is going to produce a profound shift in worker preferences. And I think employers need to recognize that and see it. We see what's happening with people leaving now in this great recession. And I see a lot of companies throwing money at it. I need to pay more. I need to pay more. I would argue you need to pay competitively, but what gets or keeps people in your organization at this point in time has to do with flexibility, relationships, and valuing the person as a person in the organization. And I picked this image here on purpose. It's the remnants after a hurricane. And clearly some of the houses did quite well, and a lot of them are completely wiped out. And I think that summarizes for me a lot of the pandemic. There are folks that were hardly touched by it, and there are a lot of people that were absolutely devastated by it. And I think we need to recreate, we need to rebuild the world that we're in now in a way that balances those 2 extremes. And finally, this is more the academic audience, I think we need to learn from this pandemic and embrace what it has taught us in a very painful way. And that means embracing practice. And I know that people have talked about that forever. And there's a lot of barriers to doing that. And at the same time, my argument would be, it will never happen unless you individually want it to happen. And I think that means embracing the kinds of questions that make a practical difference. Because I really believe, and I think you can show, that papers that tackle important practical problems tend to be published in really good journals. I think you need to embrace the questions that do not neatly fit theory, because that is the opportunity to change or extend theory. The question may be focused on the phenomena, but the solution to it can still be coming from a theoretical origin. And every major journal wants research that's going to extend or change theory. Well, what better opportunity than embracing the kinds of unanswered questions that the world is dealing with right now? I think a lot of it comes from embracing performance. What is the organization trying to do with respect to its performance, and starting from that space and working backwards to the kinds of resources that matter? And then finally, I think maybe the one that requires the most time, but the one that has just the most personal satisfaction, embracing practice and practitioners. Listening, not showing up and taking on the role as the expert, but walking into a room of practitioners and embracing the opportunity to be the least intelligent person in the room. What I try to do a lot of time, working with talent leaders, HR officers, chief HR officers, I don't try to talk as much as I try to listen and ask questions, because I don't think anybody has as good a sense of what's going on as the practitioners do. And they're smart people looking for solutions. And I think they do a really good job of cutting through some of the solutions that we may offer from an academic side that are just simply not going to be feasible. Well, rather than discovering all that on the back end, working and talking with practitioners, getting in the trenches, not just coming in and doing executive education, getting in there and trying to work collaboratively with, people from the line, the managers that are running the different functions, learning their world and trying to do research that's jointly developed with them and on the science side, on the academic side. That's where I think you realize that this is not only doable, but in fact, it actually is not that complicated. And all of the 1,000 reasons why it doesn't happen more, I think the bottom line comes down to it happens if you want to. And that's the thing I want to leave everybody with, is just to please, especially on the academic side, put yourself out there and realize that the practice world is very much as part of your world as the academic one. So I'm going to stop there. I hope we have an opportunity to have more of a conversation now. I'd like to just thank everybody for your time tonight. I hope that you found something out of that interesting. And I'm curious to see if anybody was able to identify the common theme across the various actors or actresses or musicians that I put in there. So I'll just say thank you.
Thanks very much, Rob. Really enjoyed the talk. Lots of fantastic, really thought-provoking questions, and really appreciate it. There are some questions that have popped up in the Q&A, and for those of you who haven't noticed, there's a little button down at the bottom of the screen for Q&A. Please feel free to post your questions there. The people who post questions, you'll only be able to see your own question, but I can see them, and I'll pose them to Dr. Ployhart, and so feel free. The first question that rolls in, and I don't have any answers yet to your question, is when it comes to focusing on firm performance. Angela Chen asks, what do you think about rethinking what we think value means in human terms instead of merely economic terms?
Yeah, I think it's a great question, and I think that's actually the conversation, the question that's being discussed among HR leaders, is that the purely economic focus on trying to value talent, and I'm not criticizing the field here because I'm saying it should be reoriented. I've published papers on the importance of trying to provide better financial estimation of human capital resources. So I am throwing myself in the body of research that probably needs to change. I think what the pandemic has exposed is something that we already knew but didn't focus on, that it's difficult to put a financial valuation on human capital resources. And to a certain degree, I think the HR function needs to do that so that we're credible and able to show the value of what we do to, say, a chief financial officer, or argue for our interventions relative to a marketing intervention. Like, I get that. But when the human element is not fully captured in those valuations is where I think then they become a double-edged sword, in the sense that we're not capturing, let's just take an environment a lot of people are in today, where maybe they're still working, but there's just an exhaustion. And I think that's the piece of the Great Resignation that hasn't fully been recognized, is that of the people who haven't left, there's just a general exhaustion in a large part of the workforce. I hear that, I see it, we see it in engagement surveys. And what's that exhaustion do? Especially when you're working from home in a remote environment. Stress, mental health issues that spill over to your family, the tension that a lot of people are unprepared for, shifting quickly between work and home because you're working from home. Like, those things take a toll, they have a cost, and they're not captured in the typical ways that we've talked in the literature about human capital and its financial impact. And so I think what it means is that the human capital literature, which is largely focused on KSAOs, I think we need to look at other kinds of psychological resources, whether those are health related, whether they're engagement, because I actually think that the human impact on business has been underestimated by our focus purely on human capital resources. How people work together is going to be driven a lot by personality characteristics or, the way that people are motivated and their own motives. And a lot of times we're not capturing those parts. So I hope that answers your question, but my simple answer is I agree with you, and I don't think the literature has adequately recognized that.
Thanks. I have a few more questions have rolled in, but two of our panelists have addressed your question about the relationship to the actors in the talk, and both Marie-Hélène and Monica have suggested the actors are all Canadian.
Are comedian?
Canadian.
Canadian, okay, I was gonna say, that is exactly right. I had a lot of fun trying to fit different Canadian celebrities to the different points. I had to cut out a few that I was really excited about, but I wanted the theme to run through. I'm glad you picked up on that right away.
Well, thanks for acknowledging our Canadianness. Chris Chan asks, what would you say to companies like Tesla, JP Morgan, other Silicon Valley firms that are trying to get people back to work in person in the workplace? Yeah,
so what I would say honestly is I'm not sure what you should do. So maybe a disappointing answer, but it's an honest one. And the reason I say that is because I think this question about hybrid is not an industry question. I think it is something that Lucy and Alzieri had said, it's all about the work. And I think that every organization is uniquely situated in terms of its strategy and how it implements that strategy. And I absolutely believe that for some companies, they're going to need their folks in all the time. I think what it also means, though, is that for those jobs and occupations that have the flexibility, that have the opportunity to have remote work, I think they have to take a good look at not just their immediate competition, but competition broadly, to think about the consequences of not offering remote work. Because right now, I think, and in the near future, a lot of people, I'll back up a second. I think a lot of companies, a lot of leaders would have said, there's no way that you can put people at home. You can't do remote work. They're not gonna work as hard. They're not gonna be as productive. Like, you can't do it. And what I hear from chief HR officers is that experiment proved that it can work. And that whether or not it always works is the question, and the right way to make it hybrid work. So, I think the practitioner community has seen the positive benefits that can happen. The question now is identifying the situations where it should happen and how to do that well. So take a company like Tesla, where, from what I understand, strong desire to bring people back in. I think they're going to lose some talent as a result of that. I don't know whether that's the wrong choice for them, however. I think it remains to be seen under which context hybrid works and where it works well. And again, that's the opportunity for research on the academic side. We don't know the preconditions that need to be in place to make it work. But I think for I'll give you an example. What I heard from one of the organizations we work with is that if we're not going to offer hybrid options, we have to be ready to, we have to commit to losing a really significant part of our core workforce. And that's just a choice, right? It's a strategic choice. I also hear from some of those companies that workers who have left are coming back. Those who decided to resign are actually deciding to come back and see if they still have a home. So I think we're in the sorting period. I think we don't have the direct answers that organizations need on what to do, but at the same time, I think organizations are experimenting, and there is a lot of really valuable theoretical insight that's being created right now in practice that academics would be well served to be listening to as a way to just descriptively collect and figure out, understand it from a theoretical perspective.
Thank you. Minjong Jun asks, could you elaborate more on the aspect of personality-based human capital resources? Does it contain emotion control capabilities? Is there any special reason for naming personality rather than emotion, attitudes, motivations, or other psychological names?
Yeah, so that one's definitely falls into the academic side of why I kind of made that point, and why the field does in general. You know, one of the things I thought was kind of interesting about the human capital resource space from a strategy perspective was that they just referred to it. You know, their focus was on, you know, what it does for performance or competitive advantage or value creation and capture. And they weren't so concerned about what the resource was itself. And for their research questions, I mean, that was totally appropriate. I don't have a criticism with any of that. But coming from a psychology perspective, what I was struggling with is, well, what do you mean a resource? Like what specific resource are we talking about here? And it didn't seem like there was really much attention or interest in answering that question. And, you know, people would talk about, well, human capital are skills or abilities or things like that. But the psychologist in me says, well, yeah, but which, right? I mean, which ones? We make really big distinctions between these things because different types of performance are predicted by different types of KSAOs. Different personality traits are relevant for different kinds of behaviors. So that's a really big question, you know, in psychology. And so I tried to publish a couple papers that they ultimately got in, but I was using a measure of personality that was in a service context. And I think it got rejected the first place I sent it, or maybe the first couple. And the consistent theme was personality is not human capital resources. Everybody knows human capital resources were defined by Becker in 1964 in their education and experience. And actually Becker in 1964 doesn't provide a precise definition of human capital at all. But I was really frustrated with it because how could that not be a human capital resource? And so where the field is today, and I mean, my colleagues and I'm not going to try to say that this originated with me, but my colleagues and we tried really hard to put out a definition of human capital resources that would connect micro and macro areas. And it originated in the psychological definitions of KSAOs. And so from that perspective, when I just said personality, I'm just kind of using a generic term for it. I would like to actually see people talk about the more specific types of personality like conscientiousness or things like that. So I'm using personality as just kind of a broad label to keep it simple. But the question about attitudes or engagement or motivation or things like that, I think from a scientific perspective, those are important and they are important collective resources. But from a science perspective, I would not call them human capital resources because they're not relatively stable. And I think the hallmark of human capital resources is their stability, because that's how we're hiring people and that's how we're basing training decisions on and succession, you know, types of decisions on. Those other things are resources. And I think they're really important. And I actually think that if we bring those into the literature, that we're going to do a much better job of predicting performance. But because they're more state-like characteristics because they're malleable and they move around so much, I'd be reluctant to call them human capital. And that's kind of an academic distinction, but I think it's a really important practical one as well, because if we just lump all these things together, how can we ever have an actionable literature for practice if we do that? If we lump all these things together, then anything's a resource. And so if a company comes to me and says, hey, I'm trying to achieve higher customer loyalty, what would you recommend in terms of building the resources to do that? My answer would be human capital resources. And I helped this individual in absolutely no way. So, you know, I think there are lessons to learn on the micro side of all this in terms of precision and driving performance through resources.
It's kind of on the topic of selection anyway. So
Yes.
INSUO asks, COVID-19 has already changed HR practices in very radical ways. One of them is hiring without direct interpersonal contact. In your view, what are the challenges and pitfalls associated with virtual hiring?
Yeah, another great area for, if there are any doctoral students that are listening and you are wondering what to do a dissertation on, like listen to the news, you know, pay attention to what HR leaders, business leaders are talking about, and then just do that. That's your dissertation, because this is like, again, where I think the literature was caught flat-footed, the scientific literature. try to answer the question, I think the ship has sailed on online virtual interviews. And what I hear is that, again, leaders that said there is no way they would ever do that are the same leaders that are saying there's no way they're investing all the money in flyouts for these early kinds of interviews. Not universally, but at large scale. Whenever you see a cost savings in an organization, like the cost savings that came about by reduced travel in the HR space, flyouts for interviews, flyouts for executive education, things like that. When those costs go away, I'm not convinced that you're going to get that money back post-pandemic. So what I hear and see is that the HR leaders are relying on online, virtual to cover a lot of the entry level, early interviews, hiring interviews, virtual fairs, things like that. I think a lot of that is here to stay. The pros and cons to it, in some ways, the cons are ones I think we'd already be familiar with. But on the other hand, I think what's missing are the pros yet. Can you deliver the same quality at scale with online interviews that you're going to get in person? One of the things that I think is really interesting is that you can record so easily the virtual interviews, online interview. And my prediction is I think if you record those videos, that cleans up a lot of bad behavior on the part of interviewers, or maybe non-HR folks who are conducting the interviews, and HR tries to tell them what to do to follow best practice, but you're not going to tell, nobody knows more than the manager who's doing the work, right? I think the minute you put those things on record is the minute you see a lot of questionable behavior by interviewers start to get cleaned up. So I think a potential there is actually to have maybe more accurate interviews, more opportunities to train and develop interviewers in ways that maybe we wouldn't have anticipated before. For the generation that's growing up with all this, I think they're rolling with the punches. I don't think they're really affected much by it. It may not be their preference. I don't know that online interviews recruit talent the same way. I think there's a real powerful experience to bring somebody on site so they can see. But on the other hand, if you're doing remote work, where are you going to take them? Tell them to turn around and look at their room for their on-site experience. I mean, it's an interesting dynamic. The other thing, though, I'll say, Insoo, just before I leave it. So I debated about leaving up some of the stuff in my background for this presentation, and ultimately I decided it's consistent with the theme of my talk. I have heard a number of HR leaders say that as everything shifted to online meetings, Zoom meetings, and all of that, that oddly enough, they got to learn a lot more about their coworkers and colleagues because everybody was doing it from home. And after a while, everybody got tired of just having virtual backgrounds. So, they'd see, their boss's guitar in the background and go, I never knew you played guitar. They would see a painting or something and they'd say, well, who did the painting? Oh, I did that. And it stimulated conversation in ways that you're not going to get in the office. And so I left the stuff up behind me because that's what I'm interested in. And I listened to these folks and I thought it's an opportunity for me to build better personal relationships with my students and the people I'm working with. Well, on the flip side, how much does having that stuff back there throw off interviews, right? Does having a plain background produce a less attractive interview? Does having a virtual background give the impression of less transparency? Does having the Lego set that one of my kids made that has the yellow submarine tell people too much that I like the Beatles, and maybe that I shouldn't be doing that, right? So all of that, I think, totally open territory. And again, what an exciting time to pitch to an organization. You're struggling with it. I want to study it. Can we work together and try to find a solution here that benefits both of us?
Yeah, so many great research questions coming out, and what is a realistic job preview anymore? But Etka Topalolu asks, do you think that these hybrid work challenges are different for employees who were looking for a company pre-pandemic and employees who are hired during or post-pandemic?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I don't have even, I just total speculation. I think there'd be two things to think about to answer it. I don't have an answer, but one would be, I think they would be different for people who are already in the workforce pre-pandemic and are now, whether they're in person or doing some kind of hybrid. I think there's been, just for a lot of people, very fundamental changes in the way they think about work and how central work should be to their identity and everything else. On the flip side, from what I understand, and it's not research I'm very familiar with, it also seems like productivity is actually increased due to the pandemic. For people are working from home, they don't have a commute. And you'd think that you'd get that commuting time back to do something different, but what it appears to be the case is that people are using that commuting time to do more work. And so, it's like pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, I think there is a difference between those two things, regardless of how much you may be in person or remote. My other caveat to the answer would be, I think pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, for the generation that's coming into the workforce at this point in time, I think there is the pandemic entry to work period is, my prediction would be, just going to fundamentally shape their views about a lot of things, to where they wouldn't know themselves pre-pandemic had they had that opportunity. I just, again, the prediction would be, and it's what I see with the students that I either teach or I'm working with, is that it's just, there's a lot more humanity, I think is maybe the way to say it, that they want to have work that has more purpose. And we've heard that for a while, but I think you see that they want to work for a place that's going to treat them as a genuine person. We hear a lot about inclusion, bring your authentic self to work. And I think we've heard that, but I think what people want now post-pandemic, it's not enough to hear it, they want to experience it individually, they want to see it. And so I think, and the short answer to your question is yes, there is a big difference between the two. But again, I'd be struggling to find a literature that actually helps support that prediction.
Thanks. Afshan Rauf asks, you talked about psychological resources. What about social and organizational capital? Do these have a big influence on human capital resources?
Yeah, that's an easy one to me. I'd say yes, having not talked about most of that. But I didn't want to, yes, social capital especially, talk about like one of the biggest areas that is a disconnect between different disciplines academically. Where human capital ends, social capital begins, vice versa. Whether there's even a meaningful distinction between those things. I mean, maybe if we started from scratch and forget how we were trained, we wouldn't even use human and social capital. It'd be some kind of like hybrid of those two things. Absolutely, I think they are critical. They're neglected in a lot of the human capital literature. And there's papers that I know that are in press. I'm not on them, or I'd share them, but that are coming out that speak directly to that. And I think you're going to see a shift in that over the next 10 years as those areas start to merge together. Thanks.
The Q&A has a lot of comments, Rob, about how inspiring this talk has been and how inspired the participants have been by your research in general. And so I've copied the other comments in the Q&A, and I'll share those with you so that you can read their comments. There's a hard stop on this webinar in a couple of minutes. So I'll just use this time to thank the participants for joining us today. Thank you everybody for joining. Rob, thank you so much for agreeing to do this talk. It's been such a pleasure, and I wish I had my pen and paper to be writing research questions down, because there's so much has come out of this. And I'd like to say thank you as well to Monica for the speaker series and enabling this whole HR Talks event to take place. Thanks again, Rob. We've enjoyed it so much, and thank you everybody for participating. Hope to see you again soon.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you very much, Dr. Belcourt, for setting this up. And again, everybody from York. I mean, fantastic you do this. It was just a real privilege to be able to do it. And especially, I hope to do it in a way that's so consistent with what you've been doing, you know, in York. I mean, it's inspiring. So thank you all very much. It's an honor.
Well, and I want to add my special thanks because, as you know, one of the themes throughout my career was to try to link practitioners and academics. And so I was especially heartened by your view that we should actually be listening to the HR practitioners right now, because they are in fact driving the experiments. And I've just come off a 3-day seminar listening to HR practitioners and how they're managing all these questions. And you're absolutely right in your conclusion. We have a lot to learn from them and lots of interesting research questions to validate that.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.